Well, the Samsung Galaxy A50 has been out for many years now, so let's go and see how this phone holds up in 2023. Now, I don't think this phone is worth buying in any capacity anymore. I mean, this was a phone that came out, in 2019, and it was a budget phone that Samsung had made, but I do think this was a really interesting approach from Samsung. They ended up making a lot of these types of A-series budget phones, and I think it was actually a really good look from them. And looking forward, their A-series has been pretty successful for the most part. However, with the A50, this phone was super nice. I liked it at the time, but it's not really worth buying anymore. But if you want to buy some phones I would recommend buying this year, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the Galaxy A50, on the front, we did have a pretty big 6.4-inch Super AMOLED display. Now, this was a very big panel at the time, and it still is. It's still bigger than something like a Galaxy S23. I think it's about the same size almost as like a Galaxy S23 Plus, everything considered. It's definitely not as nice as those phones, but you did actually have a 1080p Super AMOLED display. So with a display like that, it's honestly, again, very surprising because you wouldn't think like a phone like this for that price tag at the time would end up having a Super AMOLED display. Most of the time they would put like a TFT panel or like an IPS panel. In this case, they put a decent display on it, which was honestly very surprising. So that in and of itself was very cool. On top of that, you also had fairly slim bezels around this phone. So you had a little tiny bezel at the bottom, but then at the top you had a little bit of like an infinity V display, which was kind of nice. And that was something that I really did like on this phone. And that kind of stuff will really does, make this phone and that much more future-proof looking forward. And I mean, that's something I'm really excited about for this phone too. Like 10 years from now, how this phone is going to look, it's going to be a lot better than phones 10 years old at this moment will probably look, to be honest. Now on the bottom, you had the charging port, which was pretty standard. You had the headphone jack too, but then you also had a microSD card slot on this phone as well, which is honestly very cool. So having a microSD card slot on a phone like this is awesome. Majority of the phones nowadays have pretty much removed them entirely, but I'm glad this phone still had it. It still kind of gives us some hope that maybe something like this will happen in the future. Some Samsung phones that they do make do still have microSD card slots, I think, but most of them probably don't nowadays. Now on the back, we had our plastic back, which was pretty much expected. We weren't expecting some like crazy glass back on this type of phone. It was going to be plastic no matter what way we look at it. We had a kind of like a dual camera setup, which we'll talk about in a second, but there were some pretty big things that this phone was pretty much missing out on. One of those things is IP certification. There pretty much was no IP certification on this phone, which is expected when you're getting a cheaper phone like this. What do you expect, to be honest? You were also getting pretty much no wireless charging either, which is kind of interesting, but regardless, 2019 phones, I guess it's okay if it's like a budget phone, that doesn't have wireless charging. It's kind of understandable. So that kind of covers it up here. That's pretty much what we were working with in this specific situation. It still looks fairly nice. It doesn't really look that outdated, and that's just kind of how this phone holds up right now. Now, in terms of the camera setup, so when I said I had a dual camera setup, it kind of was more of like a triple camera setup, but really only two of the cameras really matter. So you had a 25 megapixel wide angle lens, an 8 megapixel ultra wide camera, and then a 5 megapixel depth lens. Now with this type of phone, what's crazy is that this phone, I mean, there's not really a whole, big amount of stuff going on with this camera. The numbers are high, but that doesn't really mean too much. Even the front camera was 25 megapixels and that was a wide angle lens, and there really wasn't a whole lot going for this phone if I'm being honest. So for one, I mean, you did have the ability of shooting 1080p video on the front and the back, but with 25 megapixels, you would assume that it was like a way higher amount of resolution you can film in, but that wasn't the case. Again, megapixels don't really mean everything. It could mean some things, but majority of the time, that's not really the case. So in this specific situation, we had an ultra-wide camera, which was nice. We had, a depth lens, which doesn't really matter too much, but that's kind of all you were getting. And with a phone like the Galaxy A50, I mean, this camera is not going to be that great. A phone like a Galaxy S10, even a Galaxy S9, even a Galaxy S8 may give you better capability, even though those are single lenses, not the S10, but the S9 and S8. Those are single lenses, but you'll probably end up getting better quality photos and videos from that type of phone than from something like the A50. So that's just kind of how these things go. And in case for, this specific device, it is kind of already outdated. It's not really worth buying anymore either. And the camera is pretty much one of those big reasons as well. So that kind of covers it up there too. Now, in terms of the actual software and the longevity, this is one of those areas of this phone that, again, it's not really worth buying too much because it's been out outdated with software for a few years now. So it did start off with Android 9, which was when One UI 1 kind of came out, which was kind of nice, but it ended with Android 11. So that is kind of another thing about this phone. I mean, if you wanted it to get a phone that lasted longer, well, of course you can get the A52 or A53, whichever one is the most recent one now. Those ones are going to be the better devices. But in this specific situation, it again doesn't make any sense buying a phone like this because you're already going to be outdated with software. And that's how these things happen, and that's how these things go. When you're getting a phone that's already outdated with software, it makes a less and less sense of buying it, and this is pretty much no exception. So from that perspective, again, buying something like a Galaxy A50 doesn't make too much sense here either. And that's kind of how to kind of wrap up the software support standpoint as well. Now, performance-wise, this device does have that Exynos 9610 chipset inside, has a Mali GPU, which again, not a lot of people are fond of, including myself, and it has 4GB of RAM on the base models, but it does go up to 6GB of RAM. Now that RAM portion always kind of threw me off because it was a lot more RAM than I was expecting, especially if you get the 6GB of RAM option. I think the Galaxy S10 started off with 6GB of RAM too. Like, that is a lot of RAM to have, especially with that type of chipset inside. Now, this wasn't the slowest phone when it first came out, but it definitely was not the fastest phone. And if you were buying this phone brand new, you could easily get a used, probably Galaxy S9 or Galaxy S8 during that moment for way cheaper than this thing. And that type of performance would probably be equal, if not better, than this specific phone. So that's kind of how I always felt about these kind of like budget tier phones. Some are really good, and some of them really aren't the best ones that you should go and buy. Now, with something like the Galaxy A50, if you're trying to go ahead and do very, very basic tasks, this phone's probably going to be okay. But if you try to take it up a notch, like I said before, and if you try to play like even somewhat intensive games or somewhat intensive whatever, that is pretty much going to be, where this specific phone kind of starts meeting the rubber, or the road to the rubber, whatever that saying is. It's not going to be that great of a performing phone. It's really been outdated quite a bit. Everyone kind of knows this, is not a secret. So in this specific situation, it's not really worth buying anymore, mostly because of the performance. It's already outdated with software. The cameras aren't that great, and now the performance really isn't even top tier. You're just kind of stuck in a situation. It's kind of a lose-lose buying this phone. But maybe when it first came out, it really wasn't that bad. And that's just something you kind of have to keep remembering. So to kind of sum up this whole entire video, what I'll tell you is, I think the Galaxy A50 clearly is not worth buying anymore. I mean, this is a phone that probably was okay when it first came out, but it quickly became kind of outdated, and that's exactly the situation that we're in now. It's a phone that's not really worth buying anymore. It's way worth buying something like a Galaxy S21, an S21 FE, and a Galaxy S20 FE, even a Samsung Galaxy S10. Those phones I would probably recommend more so than this specific phone, to be honest. So I think this phone was pretty important when it first came out, but now it's pretty much not worth buying at all. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that will mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.